In this lecture, we will be focusing on religion in Mesoamerica, beginning with some of the earliest evidence we have for religion in this part of the world, and continuing with some modern examples of religious practice, particularly in Oaxaca, Mexico, where I've done research and have the most personal experience. So we will be considering what are the unique aspects of Mesoamerican religion? How has Mesoamerican religion both shown continuity and change during, major periods of reformation in Mesoamerica's history? And then we'll also be comparing Mesoamerican religions to those elsewhere in the Americas, as well as, in a very general sense, how they compare to Asian religions, for example. So again, here is our map of Mesoamerica. People's maps of Mesoamerica vary. This map does include a fair amount of West Mexico, which is sometimes kept out of maps of Mesoamerica. So this just kind of, once again, helps us reframe the region that we're talking about. In terms of the features of Mesoamerican religion, it's likely that it took on sort of a unique character during the early formative period, and based on the limited evidence we have for anything before that from the Archaic or Paleo-Indian period, it looks as though perhaps religion in this part of the world was generally similar to that happening elsewhere in the Americas, and that in a sense it was the early formative period when communities settle down into these villages and then gradually shift toward agriculture, that we see some kind of unique aspects of Mesoamerican religion emerge. So that's something that your textbook suggests, that Mesoamerican religion became distinctive during the early formative period, and perhaps that's one of the key changes of the early formative period. And this fits what we think about other major changes happening during that time, such as shifts in subsistence economy, evidence for language diversification, probably sort of supported by increasing sedentism and the kind of separation of formerly mobile hunting and gathering groups, and changes in social organization toward greater social inequality and political complexity. So in a sense, the early formative period can be seen as kind of a key watershed moment in change in the history of the Americas, even if things like actual reliance on agriculture weren't fully established until the middle formative period. So this is why I focus my research on the early formative. It's because it seems as though all of these aspects of Mesoamerican society were kind of crystallizing in a sense. So your book suggests that the Olmec style is a representative of the establishment of Mesoamerica as an interaction sphere, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit. But as I mentioned, other lines of evidence, changes in iconography, reflected in part through the Olmec style, evidence for linguistic change, as well as evidence we have even in my own dissertation research for changes in settlement and subsistence, all suggest that the early formative was this key moment of change. Now, in relation to other New World religious traditions, before we talk about how Mesoamerican religion is unique, there are some aspects of Mesoamerican religion that actually fall right in line with other Native American belief systems, especially in North and Central America. So all the way from Canada through the United States, what's now the United States, down through Mesoamerica, Central America, and even northern South America, like Ecuador and parts of Peru. Native American groups have a deep and sort of all-encompassing sort of concept of the sacred cardinal directions, and how, for example, ancestor spirits or rain deities or lightning deities or storm deities may kind of live in these different realms of the celestial universe and sort of can visit the earth by coming from these different directions. There are sacred colors associated with these directions, and we actually see this appear again and again in Mesoamerican belief. When I read ethnographies about the Lakota and Dakota, when I find out about stuff all the way up into Canada and things including different Mesoamerican traditions, the colors vary, some of the details vary, but it's an amazing, consistent element of Native American belief. And in a sense, this image that's been called the Aztec calendar stone, it's actually not really a calendar. It's more like a map of the cosmos. The Aztec sunstone, the calendar stone, is itself a representative of this sacred belief in the cardinal directions, and sort of indicates that this northern Mexican group that became a Mesoamerican group fell right in line with this traditional belief about the sacred cardinal directions. So, as I mentioned, there are a fair amount of publications, including your textbook, that talk about how the Aztecs held this belief about the sacred cardinal directions. There are numerous publications about how the Maya in the classic period held these beliefs about the sacred cardinal directions. And in my own research, I've found what I think is evidence that beliefs in the sacred cardinal directions and ritual deposits sort of laid out as a cosmogram, kind of a map of the universe, and considering and in relation to these sacred cardinal directions, go back to the beginning of the early formative period, to nearly 4,000 years ago. So here at the site of La Consentida in Costa Oaxaca, my own excavations uncovered a ritual cache that was in close association with about 8 human burials. It was just a couple of meters from most of these, actually a few centimeters from 1 or 2 of them. And within the deposit, we found the complete skeleton of a venomous reptile. This is a beaded lizard. It's a close relative of the Gila monster. It's known as Heloderma horridum. At its nose was the fossilized 8-million-year-old tooth of a bull shark. It may have actually, look how sharp it is, it may have actually been used as a ritual bloodletter. There's some precedent for that in Mesoamerica. And then at its tail, and this is why I've cited the Carmack textbook, at its tail, just like the Aztecs saw the south as the realm of their warrior bird god Huitzilopochtli, and that was the realm of the bird. In this ritual deposit, and this is really what kind of convinced me, there's a playable bird instrument, one of the oldest musical instruments in Mesoamerica, found at the tail of the reptile, and that fits with the Aztec sort of depiction of the south as this kind of celestial, airy realm of the birds. And then if you think about the north as this kind of subterranean kind of underworld, watery underworld, that's where the shark tooth was. So in a sense, I think this ritual deposit basically is an example, a really early example of a specialized ritual practitioner, some might call them a shaman, who has specific knowledge about ritual practice and religion and has left this deposit probably in relation to the nearby burials. So in your textbook, as I mentioned, the authors focus on Olmec style and its interest in divine ancestors being portrayed as were-jaguars. And the textbook sort of argues that this shows a growing importance of property that would be expected in an agricultural society. I think we should maybe question some of the economic and ecological biases, in a sense, of this argument. That religion kind of comes out of agriculture. In a sense, I think we might almost look at it the other way around in some cases. But I do think it's okay to be critical of our textbook and to question the assumptions about relationships between nature and culture that come up in this textbook. So, for example, according to Gosson in the textbook, and this is a quote, shamanic belief and supernatural mediation formed a substratum of spirituality that in Mesoamerica was a sort of a common element with Mesoamerican religions and other New World religions, and in fact ancient Asian religions as well. You can see some argument for this on page 507 of your textbook. So this argument suggests that shamanism is a deep and sort of central element of Mesoamerican belief. Gosson, the author, sees shamanism as stemming from pragmatic concerns between hunter-gatherers and the natural world, which once again suggests the sort of ecological, environmental bent that this textbook is taking on the topic of religion. So in this slide you can see different sites around Mesoamerica where there's some evidence of Olmec influence. Now again, the Olmec were emanating from the Gulf Coast, which you can see near number 15 there with the colossal Olmec head. That's where the actual homeland of the Olmec was, but look at how widespread was Olmec influence by the Middle Formative Period, with all these other sites around Mesoamerica showing some indication of Olmec style, and thus arguably kind of a spreading religious, philosophical, and iconographic style around Mesoamerica, kind of a growing consistency, if you will, in Mesoamerican religion, probably spurred in part by increasing interaction and trade throughout Mesoamerica. Now, some of the elements we can see for formative period Mesoamerican religion that are certainly identified for the Olmec, and in fact in some cases appear earlier in the Soconusco region, but which grow to really sort of occur across Mesoamerica, include iron ore mirrors that could be worn on the head or worn as a pectoral on the chest. And there's different arguments about what these mirrors could be for: to flash light in the eyes of the commoners if you're a powerful shaman, or even, imagine this, it's been argued that some of these mirrors may have been used to reflect light and start a small fire. Think of how powerful the symbolism of starting a fire would be in an ancient society like this. And now another element of Olmec iconography that spreads across Mesoamerica by the Middle Formative Period is their small-scale sculptural art, so things like figurines, masks, and so forth. Here's an example of an Olmec-style quote-unquote hollow baby figurine that actually was found in the highlands of Oaxaca, pretty far away from the Olmec region. So what are some of the features of Mesoamerican religion at the time of the Olmec? We can see in their carvings and in the interpretations we've made of particularly their monumental sculpture and small-scale ceramic and stone sculpture, a focus on the importance of ancestors, probably as semi-divine characters, ancestors kind of becoming deities over time. Sometimes these are portrayed as were-jaguars. It's also likely that shamans or ritual practitioners were seen as having the power of transforming into jaguars. We'll get back to that shortly. Nahualism appears to be important in here, the ability to transform. Now, as your textbook argues, this suggests a growing importance of property, perhaps, in an agricultural society. If you're focused on your ancestors, you may be focused on basically rights of inheritance of property, which would be increasingly important in a society that's becoming more and more agriculturalist. That's something that your textbook is suggesting. And I'm not arguing that that's completely false. Certainly that might be true in, for example, modern Western society. But I do think that it's worth questioning this a little bit. The concluding chapter in your textbook, written by Carmack, in my opinion, has a generally ecological perspective that it tends to argue, Carmack tends to argue that these major factors of Mesoamerican belief and culture and politics and so forth are all kind of tied to subsistence and to ecology and the environment. And I'm not going to argue that that's not true at all, but I do think it implies a kind of bias about relationships between nature and culture, in essence that nature shapes culture rather than this being a two-directional system of influence where culture can also shape nature. People also have individual choices that they can make and so forth. So I think this is a little bit ecologically deterministic, in my opinion, but I'll let you make your own mind up about that. So some of the famous art, just to give us a reminder, some of the famous art and architecture and carvings and so forth of the Olmec that have informed these interpretations include the colossal heads, these heads the size of Volkswagens, that in a sense, this is something that is unique to the Gulf Coast, more or less. It's more the small-scale sculptural art, such as the image on the top, and then other things like carvings, pottery, even art in caves and so forth that show up elsewhere in Mesoamerica. And then we also have depictions of what appear to be, the elites, people in positions of power, even perhaps as kind of spiritual ancestors, as you can see in the carving on the far left. And then particularly in the small-scale art, the Olmecs are known for this tradition of the were-jaguar, sort of like a werewolf, where you've got what appear to be ritually powerful shamans or ritual practitioners, basically religious leaders, who are probably also political leaders, who had the ability to transform. And this is something that's actually an ongoing tradition in Mesoamerican religious life that we can talk about. Okay, so there are some features of Mesoamerican religion that make it both a prime example of New World religions or religions among native societies of the Americas, but also some unique aspects. So as your book discusses, there is a very ancient tradition in Mesoamerica of what the book calls shamanic belief, or you might say specialized ritual practitioners, and the supernatural mediation that they play, the role that they play. In other words, that it takes a special ritual practitioner or shaman to kind of be a go-between between the land of the living and the land of the spirits and deities and so forth. Now, this is a common feature in other New World traditions, and in fact, this kind of belief in shamanism and divination and similar sort of like conduit-style religions is similar as well to Asian traditions. Now, I probably would be careful about publishing this because it's quite an argument, but in my opinion, it's possible that some of those consistencies with Asian religions could in fact be an ancient shared tradition going back 20,000 years that, shows the relationship of Mesoamerican societies to its ancient roots in Asia. Now, according to your textbook, this demonstrates pragmatic concerns between the hunter-gatherer and the natural world. Again, that's kind of an ecological model, and I think it may be problematic. There are, as we mentioned, some other widespread traditions to talk about with Mesoamerican and New World religions in general, including the sacred cardinal directions, humanity having been created and destroyed multiple times, as is described in the Popol Vuh, as is believed by the Aztecs, the multiple sons of creation and so forth. These are common elements among the Mesoamerican religions, and they are shared by some other New World religions. Now, in the formative period in particular, as I mentioned, it appears that as though religion was becoming more complex with a greater emphasis on fertility. Now, I don't just mean agricultural fertility, I mean human fertility. The textbook argues that figurines emphasizing human fertility, emphasizing, for example, nude female bodies and so forth, basically become more common as people are also becoming agriculturalists. And they're making this argument that agricultural fertility and human reproductive fertility are kind of seen as allegorical of one another. So Gosson, the author, argues that the formative period figurines kind of become emblematic of both human and agricultural fertility, that there's this symbolic association between the two, and that figurines can be seen as fertility gods. Now or fertility idols. Now there is some evidence that in the codices, for example, that the fertility of the corn crop is shown allegorically as the fertility of the newborn human child, and vice versa. You have depictions of maize plants and agave plants and so forth, also having like human babies in them. So there is some support for this. But I think there may also be some problems, and if I could speak to Gosson personally, I would, I have spoken to Jan Gasko, one of the co-authors of this book, about this argument, but I would say, there may be some problems with this model, because increasingly archaeologists believe that Mesoamericans didn't become reliant on agriculture until the Middle Formative Period, that they were horticulturalists with some domesticated crops before that. in the early formative, and yet in the early formative period there are tons and tons of ceramic figurines. So that is to say, this emphasis on female figurines appears to predate the shift to dedicated agriculture by centuries in some parts of Mesoamerica. So I would question this model, but again, I leave it up to you. The textbook provides a lot of great information. I enjoy the textbook to this class, but I also think it's okay to question it. So I leave that up to you. Now, some of the formative period figurines in question here, they really do emphasize the human form. They often emphasize the female human form. They often emphasize the human female form wearing not very much in the way of clothing. There have been different arguments about this. Could they have worn maybe paper clothing, removable clothing, almost like a modern doll, so they could change outfits? Or were they meant to be depicted nude? Note that they're not necessarily all redundant. In fact, sometimes they wear unique styles of headgear, unique styles of their hair. So in some cases it appears as though they might be schematic, just kind of representations of people. In other cases they might be specific people. And then in the lower part you can see some figurines from my own research in coastal Oaxaca. Now, just to emphasize this discussion of fertility, one of my favorite examples is a ceramic figurine from the highlands of Oaxaca, from the Tierras Largas phase, that's on the left in this image. Now, this figurine was collected in the 1970s. I wasn't part of that project. I wasn't born yet, but this was collected in the 1970s by a friend of mine on his project, and he had the figurine in a box at Quilapan, where I also do research when I'm analyzing artifacts. And he had, I think, a grad student was cleaning it for him, and was using a toothbrush to just carefully clean away dirt on the clay. These things are fired clay. They look like dirt. It can be hard to tell where they're dirty and where they're not. So this lab technician was just carefully cleaning the figurine, and between the figurine's legs continued to find a gap there, a cavity, a hole, and kept cleaning and kept cleaning and kept cleaning. And what eventually happened was this lab technician discovered that the figurine's belly was actually hollow, and within the figurine was an infant or a fetus. That basically this was a figurine that could reenact the process of birth. This is just amazing to me. I've never seen another one like it. It's a beautiful example of a formative period figurine, and clearly here I would agree with Gaussen. Clearly this figurine is focused on fertility. That other figurine in the same image appears to be a male. And then we have some figurines from coastal Oaxaca from my own research. On the top, that's actually probably part of a musical instrument that looked like a bird, and when you play these instruments they sound like birds. And then in the lower part there is broken, a female figurine with an ear spool showing that they're wearing jewelry. They have gauged ears, some kind of headgear. She's actually wearing, if you could see the back of it, she's wearing basically like a loincloth or a G-string. And the figurine is broken. It broke a little bit in excavation, but in fact most of these figurines appear to have been broken in antiquity. They were broken thousands of years ago, and that people have argued that may be because, again, remember, Mesoamerican tradition, Native American tradition is that the material world is alive. So if this figurine is alive, perhaps it's almost a vessel to contain the spirit of an ancestor. When you go to deposit it, it needs to be ritually killed. So most of these figurines are broken. Okay, so as I mentioned, I was going to return to the topic of Nahualism. Nahualism, the Nahual, is a word borrowed from the Nahuatl language, and it basically refers to the ability to transform. The ability to transform, for example, into the form of an animal, or for animals to transform into people and so forth. And there's evidence for this by at least the formative period. It may go back earlier. And then, I think this is fascinating, in the colonial period, after the Spanish show up, there are court documents that still talk about Nahualism. One of my favorite examples, from Highland, Oaxaca, in the 16th century, there is a formal legal court document from a man saying, I was returning home to the village from the capital city. My wife and her lover decided to ambush me by the side of the road to jump out and murder me. I saw them coming, so I turned into a vulture and I flew away. That's in a court document. This belief in the ability to transform, or more broadly, in kind of like a symbolic tether, a relationship, a link between the human and the animal world, is still alive in many native cultures in Mesoamerica. And I think this is one of the things that most fascinates me about Mesoamerican belief. You know, in Western society, we tend to have a dichotomous line, a break, a border between the human realm and the animal realm, between the human realm and between nature more broadly. Mesoamericans saw this as more of a spectrum, a relationship that could be transversed or transgressed, that people with certain kinds of ritual knowledge could cross that permeable boundary between the human and the other. And I find that so fascinating. I think that's a really beautiful and compelling and strange example of Mesoamerican belief that it keeps bringing me back. So I'm going to show you some cool examples. The Tuxtla statuette is one example. As is, I think this is referred to in your textbook, and you can look it up on Google Scholar. There's an article. Basically, there was an explorer. I think he was maybe in the 19th century in Central America, named Thomas Gage, who wrote about two shamans who were maybe in Guatemala, maybe in Chiapas. I'm forgetting the exact details. Two shamans from two different villages who were at war. And the way they fought was they turned into jaguars and fought at night in the forest. And according to Gage, who was a Westerner, when he met the shamans the next day, even though they had been locked up in their houses, they were all cut up and scratched as though they'd been attacked by a jaguar. So this is the Tuxtla statuette. This is an example of Olmec or perhaps Epi-Olmec art that shows what appears to be a human, maybe wearing a mask. That might be a buccal mask or a mask over the mouth. But also note the wings, note the feet. This appears to be a human, perhaps with the aid of a mask, but in a broader symbolic way, becoming a bird. In fact, people have argued that this is a human-duck hybrid. So, we talked about were-jaguars, and I gave you the analogy of a werewolf. Well, here you have, in the ancient Olmec, a were-duck. I love that. They've got a were-duck. Now, you can also see there is a script written on the were-duck, and this is in the Epi-Olmec writing style, which has not been fully translated yet, and there is debate about what this may say. So here in this schematic drawing, you can see how the text is written on the Tuxtla statuette. According to that text, according to things like bars and dots that they find on the text, they think it perhaps dates to about 162 of the Common Era, which would place it basically in the late formative period. So kind of at the end of the Olmec, kind of the Maya are on the rise. So this is considered Epi-Olmec, or kind of transitional Olmec style. And again, it's debated what's exactly being said here, but this is just one example of Nahualism in Mesoamerica. There are many others, including the were-jaguars, the stories I told you about, the vulture, etc. Okay, so during the Classic period in Mesoamerica, we see increasing emphasis on urbanization. So, for example, Monte Alban and Teotihuacan reached their greatest heights of occupation. These were not just cities in an economic and demographic sense, but they were also cosmograms, which is to say, literally the sites, along with astronomical orientations and careful planning and so forth, they mimic the heavens. They are a map of the universe, as the Mesoamericans understood it. So religion took on, an increasingly important element or an important role in the economic implications of these cities during the Classic period. Now, we also have continued evidence of the importance of the cardinal directions by groups in the Classic and Post-Classic. such as by the Aztecs. And according to my research, as I showed you earlier, I think it goes back to at least the early formative, with that ritual cache at the site I excavated, La Consentida, that dates to, I have dates that go back to 2020 BCE, but I'm, kind of estimating about 1800 BCE for that ritual deposit. So when I say that a site is a cosmogram, here's an example of the main plaza at Monte Alban, where you've got the south platform and the north platform basically lined up to be kind of a primordial underworld and a celestial overworld, and that basically the site itself is kind of a map of the universe, with almost all the buildings pointed in cardinal directions, except for building J, which appears to be pointed in alignment with some astronomical feature. Now here at the site of Teotihuacan, we have even a more grand example of the cardinal directions and the city as cosmogram. The entire city is laid out according to the Avenue of the Dead, which runs, mostly kind of north-south. You've got the Pyramid of the Sun placed in an alignment, not only with the natural cave underneath, but with the particular position of the sun at the time of the solstice. You've got the Pyramid of the Serpent and the kind of watery underworld to the south. You've got the Pyramid of the Moon and the heavens to the north. In a sense, yes, Teotihuacan was this massive urban center of perhaps 250,000 people at its height, but it was also very carefully planned and, in a sense, kind of a model of the universe. Okay, so other aspects of Mesoamerican religion during the Classic period. Well, as we've seen in the Popol Vuh, as we've seen with the relationship of, for example, the ball court to the central plaza at Monte Alban, the ball court is central to politics and religion in the Classic period. In fact, this probably goes back earlier than that to the formative and even the Archaic period. The ball court, again, it's not just a pastime. It's not just like a baseball diamond or something. The ball court is a portal to the underworld. The ball game may have implications of sacrifice. The ball may be a representative of the sun. The game itself is a process of renewal, with two teams competing, much like Huitzilopochtli for the Aztecs, to assist the sun in its journey across the sky. Now, this importance of the ball game goes back to at least the earliest ball court in Mesoamerica at the site of Paso de la Mata in the Soconusco region, but there's evidence, in part because it's so widespread, that this probably goes back to the Archaic period. In fact, there's an open space in the highland Oaxaca that dates to the Archaic period that may have been either a dance platform or a ball court. Now here we have the site of Paso de la Mata, drawn in a basically a simple sketch map. And in particular at the site, there is a chiefly house that was revamped and redesigned and rebuilt again and again, and with each iteration it became more impressive and more important relative to the other houses in the community. It became bigger and bigger and bigger, and up on a higher platform than the surrounding homes in the community. And what was that house attached to? A temple? No. A pyramid? No. A ball court. The house appears to have been the home of the people who helped organize the ball game. So the argument here, particularly by an archaeologist named John Clark, has been that the organizing of the ball game, the arranging of the bets, the bringing of the intoxicants, the all the other things that go, gambling and excitement and ritual and all the other things that go along with sport, that role of organizing the ball game may have been what helped to elevate one particular kinship group at the site of Paso de la Mata to the status of being elites. That in a sense, the ball game helped promote social inequality and the rise of social complexity in Mesoamerica. Now, the ball game became a really important element of the architecture of cities in the late formative, in the classic, and into the post-classic. Here in the Gulf Coast, epiclassic site of El Tajín, so this is at the end of the classic period. El Tajín isn't all that large a site, but it has tons of ball courts, like more ball courts than it would need. So here we can see one example of a reconstructed and beautiful eye-shaped ball court. The ball courts at El Tajín have carvings of sacrifice and ball games along the sides. There are places up above where spectators could watch, could gamble, could place wagers and so forth. So these would have been major elements of social life in the urban centers like El Tajín. And then the ball game in Mesoamerica is not gone. In fact, there were multiple ball games in Mesoamerica. So, for example, it's true that some of them don't allow you to use your hand, but others do. Here is Here's a couple of guys playing Pelota Mixteca in the highlands of Oaxaca, at the town of Yanhuitlan. You can see a video of this same festival that took place in 2006 at Yanhuitlan in the weekly module that I posted. You can see that video. And so in this game, Pelota Mixteca, a dense, heavy rubber ball comes flying at you. And much like a game of tennis or badminton or something, you basically return the serve of this heavy rubber ball with a glove that's been made out of many layers of leather, tacked together with shoe tacks. So you got this heavy, solid rubber ball flying at you. You hit it with this beautifully decorated but heavy leather glove, and you serve it back, and it works kind of like tennis or badminton with the rules, with the exception that the winning team is also conquering territory. So in this zoomed out photo, you can see the same game of Pelota Mixteca at Yanhuitlan, and the teams are going back and forth on this long, narrow court or field, playing the game, returning the serve, and then if you look closely, there's a gentleman in the center, actually looks like maybe a teenager, holding a stick. And what those sticks have on them are little colored flags. And as one team starts to win territory and, for example, force the other team to return the serve from a different position on the field, the holders of the flags will actually move back and forth along this field, thus allowing the winning team to basically conquer territory. So, in a publication I'm writing about this right now, I'm looking for analogies to help explain how this game works. It's almost like if you combined a game of tennis or badminton with a game of American football. It's got that element of both the returning of a serve, but also the conquering of territory. It's a fascinating game. It's kind of scary. That rubber ball is a solid rubber ball. It would knock you senseless if it hit you. And while I was there filming this, the guys who were playing asked me to play, and so I very briefly got a chance to try this myself. I just, tried to hit a return serve. I was terrible at it. But this is Pelota Mixteca. This is a surviving Mesoamerican ball game. Now, we know more about religion in the post-classic period, in part because when the Spanish arrived, this was, what was going on in Mesoamerica, and we have more written records, albeit from biased resources, biased source of the Spanish conquistadors and church officials. But especially for central Mexico and the Maya region, the Spanish chroniclers and their native informants were writing down a lot of information about the practices and beliefs of that time period. So it's important to remember the caveat that the Spanish had a bias about these beliefs, in some cases believing that Mesoamerican practices were, basically devil worship. Nonetheless, a lot of what we've learned about Mesoamerican religion, both for the post-classic and by analogy for earlier time periods, comes from this, time period of eventual conquest. So based on that information, on what was written down at the time of Spanish arrival, whether you want to call that conquest or that time period of the beginning of the colonial period, what do we know about Mesoamerican religion for the different groups, and how does this relate to the archaeology of pre-contact times? Well, for the Maya, according to Gosson, the author of this chapter, the Maya belief was kind of preoccupied with time as opposed to cosmovision. Some researchers have referred to this as chronovision, that their language, their concept of the movement of the universe, or the different kind of levels of existence, that their concept of the both circular and linear nature of time is an ancient element of Maya belief, and that you can actually see it like encoded in Maya language. So one example Gosson gives is, consider the linguistic evidence for the antiquity of the term kin, which refers to time as in day or sun, in multiple Mayan languages, meaning it's ancient. It's shared among these languages that have since diverged. Therefore, it suggests we've got this really ancient belief. You can see this argument on page 514. And again, time for the Maya is in a sense linear. They have a concept of historical events, but it's also circular. Time moves and kind of starts again, almost like a great wheel. And this is why the world didn't end in 2012 in December, as some conspiracy theorists were speculating. The Maya concept of time never ends. It keeps rolling over. It's just a new epoch in their concept of time. Now, for the Aztecs, Gosson describes a society that is heavily focused on fate, on destiny. Like other Mesoamerican traditions, names for the Aztec were based on the days you were born. In particular, there were midwives and basically priests who would be focused on working with mothers and working with families as they were having a new child. And you could actually bribe the midwife or the priest to give your child a more auspicious name. For the Aztecs, for example, names indicated what your future occupation was going to be, and even what your habits and so forth were going to be. So there was such a focus on fate and destiny, the tonali, for the Aztecs, associated with the birth sign, the day you were born, that could tell your parents whether you were bound to be a warrior, a priest, a thief, the town drunk. These things were all, in a sense, predicted by the day sign, the tonal. So this is a society concerned with morality. There were a lot of rules about who could, for example, drink or be drunk in public, what certain people of certain tonali were allowed to do, who could be a member of the priestly class, what were the appropriate roles for men and women, etc. So other Mesoamerican societies were kind of more flexible in these realms, but the Aztecs were pretty regimented. Now, Gosson goes on to describe some basic elements of Mesoamerican religion. So here I'm looking at about pages 530 to 531. He talks about a complementary dualism with men in the public domain and women in the domestic space. I think that's a bit of a problematic dichotomy. We'll get back to that. This gets back to Gosson's earlier argument about women being culturally conservative and sort of curators of cultural traditions, as opposed to men who are active public agents kind of causing social change. Consider the gendered assumptions of that. That would suggest that women are kind of preserving tradition and men are changing tradition. Those are some pretty strict dichotomous roles for the genders. And it leads me to wonder how much of this is modern gender dichotomy from modern Western society kind of being, in a sense, projected onto the past. Now, this may sound kind of silly, but a lot of well-respected archaeology has been based on these assumptions, and in my personal research, I think this is problematic, and I try to question these dichotomies. So in my opinion, Gosson, in a sense, kind of contradicts himself. He sees women as conservative curators of culture, but some of those same cultural practices are also very public. Ritual acts, as we've seen, ball games, public offerings, auto-sacrifice, Lady Shock drawing the rope full of spines through her tongue in front of a crowd, and so forth. These public acts are sometimes attributed to men, but actually we know that women were involved. So if women's place, according to Gosson, was kind of in the home, how did they come to be curators of sacred knowledge that he considers to be public? In a sense, I'm just saying that he's kind of contradicted himself in his terms, and I find it problematic. Now, while there is some ethnographic and archaeological evidence for gendered labor roles in Mesoamerica, I think this interpretation relies on some strict dichotomies between masculine and feminine gender, between public and domestic space, and it's something I'm questioning currently in my own research. So let's consider what we've learned, for example, about gender in Mesoamerica. Particularly for the Mixtec, genders are relatively egalitarian. Even for the Aztec and the Maya, women have traditionally done a lot of things outside the home. Women have been merchants, property owners, rulers, even warriors. In fact, the Spanish were very uncomfortable with how complementary and egalitarian some of these gender roles were in Mesoamerica, and I think this is problematic for Gosson's model. Furthermore, traditional native Mesoamerican communities had homes that were largely intervisible. They could see one another. They sometimes had open floor plans, shared patios, shared storage facilities, etc. In other words, the domestic space is not private. I think that's a Western kind of ethnocentric assumption. So now I want to move on. This slide here is about language. Gosson on page 531 later backtracks in a sense and says that language is the conservative aspect of Mesoamerican culture, not women, language. Not women or the domestic space. So consider our discussions of Mesoamerican language and literacy and those traditions. Groups of elders could oversee new ceremonies, even in an oral history type society. Strict rules of linguistic couplets and the repetition associated with sacred speech were important to language's role and tradition. So there does, in fact, seem to be, I agree here with Gosson, a link between language and cultural continuity. Now, in terms of changes in religion in the post-contact era, after the arrival of the Spanish, consider everything that we talked about in terms of religious syncretism in Mesoamerica. So the combining of pre-Hispanic and Hispanic religious influences, the Virgen de Guadalupe, as associated with Tonantzin, traditions maintained and changed over time, the Huichol peyote hunt, ball games that are still played today, dances, calendrical ceremonies. Across much of the Americas, even in ostensibly Christian festivals, Jesus Christ is often depicted as a sun god. Thunder and lightning are depicted as angels. In Mesoamerica, the cargo system, the cofradias, were enforced by the Spanish, but they actually allowed natives to maintain autonomy in some ways and to influence how their communities were organized. Gosson refers to this, and I agree with this, I enjoy this part of the chapter. He calls this an irony of the colonial era, that basically the Spanish were permitting and even supporting a tradition that was basically allowing for a lot of indigenous autonomy and syncretism. Now, there are also some modern trends. Mesoamerica continues to have a trend toward urbanization. There's a big trend even going on right now toward migration to the north, both within Mexico and within Central America, but also, from Mesoamerica to the United States, migration to the north. Transnationalism is a major factor, a modern trend. Increasingly secular politics, as, for example, in Mexico, the political regime continues to distance itself from the Catholic Church. Also a rapid expansion of evangelical missions, spreading Protestantism. Usually, when I'm in, as a foreigner, when I'm in Mexico doing research, I get stopped in all of the roadside military checkpoints and police checkpoints, and they don't ask if I'm an archaeologist. That's not the first thing they assume. They think I'm a Protestant missionary, there to spread some brand of Protestantism. In Oaxaca, for example, there's a lot of activity going on with the LDS church, and so that's what they often think. Now, as we discussed in our language lecture, much of this activity with the Protestant evangelicals is related to translating the Bible into native languages. So that refers us back to the Summer Institute of Linguistics that we talked about. So there's a lot of current trends that are going to offer some changes, some influence to Mesoamerican religion, and of course, my life won't be long enough to know, but it would be very fascinating to see over centuries how much of the ancient Mesoamerican traditions continue to be maintained and how much continues to change. So in the videos that I've posted in the weekly module, I've got some kind of low quality and older, but really interesting to watch videos of this celebration of Ayutsi and Yanhuitlan. Ayutsi is basically a carving of the Christ figure, but it's done in blackened wood. Ayutsi is actually the name of a Mixtec neighborhood of this ancient city of Yanhuitlan before Spanish arrival. And then within the festival, you've got tricksters, you've got people wearing masks, you've got the pelota mixteca that I showed you. So there's a lot of, you've got marketplaces. There's a combination, there's a syncretism of both Catholic and ancient Mesoamerican traditions in this event. At other religious festivals I've attended in Oaxaca, for example, here near the coast in Jamiltepec, you see masked performers referring to identity. So basically blackface being used to refer, in some sense, to the Afro-Mestizos descendants of the slave population that do live in coastal Oaxaca today. The pink face in the back, I've seen that an argument that that's a representation of a sunburned Spaniard. Also, note the gendered aspects here. The figure in the back wearing the yellow dress is cross-dressing. So during these festivals, you have young men dressing as young women, you have people wearing masks, you have transgressions of identity, you have the suspension of cultural practices. If you're interested in classical anthropological theory, this gets back to Victor Turner's arguments in the 1960s and 70s about the Carnival festivals in Europe, in Spain in particular, and France. So there's an element of the European Carnival mixed with Catholicism, mixed with Mesoamerican religion. It's just so fascinating. There's so much to it. The mind boggles at the cultural influences going on in modern Oaxaca, and these are the things that bring me back again and again. It's so fascinating. Another thing I've shown you before, but I think is an example of religious syncretism, here at Teotitlan del Valle in Oaxaca, the Catholic Church. If you look closely, what's in the walls of the Catholic Church? Pre-Hispanic carved stones depicting kings and queens and ritual events and deities and so forth. And then in your weekly module, I've posted a couple of videos that I share with permission of a curandera in modern coastal Oaxaca, a medicine woman, a ritual practitioner in modern coastal Oaxaca, practicing her craft with a child who is sick. In the video, the first video is a little bit difficult to watch. The child is in distress. Nobody gets hurt, but it's a little challenging to watch. And then in the second video, you can see my friend Pepe actually getting a limpia from the curandera. And again, I want to emphasize, I share these with permission, and they're not required if you're uncomfortable watching them. And then I also share once again this week a link to an ethnographic film about the Huichol peyote hunt. The Huichol video is about an hour long, maybe not quite, and it is an opportunity for extra credit.